Hey, it's Lauren. So how much can landlords raise your rent in California? Well, it depends on where you live. So the reason that it depends on where you live is because some counties and some cities have their own rent control, which is actually tighter than the state level rent control. So AB 1482, which is the statewide rent control, which is basically the umbrella that covers all of California, is really the least strict rent control. It's basically like the minimum standard that every city and county needs to adhere to. There are other cities and counties in the state of California that have decided that AB 1482 is not strict enough. And so they have enacted or had long-standing rent control that is even stricter than what AB 1482 allows. So I'm gonna give you the 7-step process to follow so that you can learn everything you need to know to find out what the rent control rules are for your area. So when you follow this 7-step process, if you're a tenant, you're gonna know if rent control applies to you and the unit that you're living in, how much your landlord can raise your rent, and what your recourse is if your landlord raises your rent too much. So if you're a landlord, this is gonna help you determine the maximum that you can raise your tenant's rent, as well as all of your other legal rights. Because if you don't follow this process, then whether you're a landlord or whether you're a tenant, you can get yourself into some legal trouble. So with that being said, let's jump into it. So step number 1 is to check and see if you are in a city or a county that has any rent freezes. For example, as of today, the city of LA until December 31st of this year, 2020, there is a complete rent freeze, which means that if your property is in the city of LA, you are not allowed to raise your tenant's rent. Your landlord cannot raise your rent. There is a rent freeze due to COVID. So that's step number 1, is find out if you are in a city or a county that has any sort of rent freeze due to COVID. Step number 2 is determine if you are in one of these cities or counties in California that has additional rent control above and beyond AB 1482. One of my favorite websites for this is Nolo. This is a legal encyclopedia, and all of the authors of this website are attorneys. And they have this amazing page right here, link in the description below, where they show you this awesome article that talks about rent control in California, and it goes metro by metro. If you scroll down, they have a chart. So it includes the municipality. So if we look at Alameda, for example, they give you an overview of the restriction that's listed in the ordinance. And then also they cite the ordinance number that is coming from. And this is a really good place to start because there is a list here. And as I scroll down, you'll see these are cities, counties, municipalities that have additional rent control that's even stricter than what is listed in AB 1482, which is the state level rent control. The next step is to actually read the ordinance. And I suggest this because this is something that's really gonna help you become a savvy investor. It's really, really important to know exactly what the rent control ordinance says for your area. So if you click over here, this takes you to where they've gone through and basically summarized all of the rent control ordinances for all of these different cities. Now, every rent control ordinance follows more or less the same template, and I'm gonna go over that with you right now so that you know what you're looking at and you know what you're looking for. What Nolo has done really well is they have taken each section of the rent control ordinance and they've summarized it really well. If we look at this first page right here, for example, if you live in Los Gatos, it gives you the name of the ordinance, the date that it was adopted, the date that it was last amended, and then it goes into each section, a really brief section that summarizes different sections of the ordinances. Most ordinances typically start with some definitions, and then they go into exemptions. So examples of exemptions, typical examples would be owner-occupied duplexes, which means a duplex where the owner lives in one unit and the tenant is living in the other unit. Those types of units might be exempt from rent control. Sometimes newer construction. If a building was built in the last 15 years, so if it's 15 years or younger, it might be exempt from rent control. There's other situations where your property may or may not be exempt. So it's really good to know just because your city has an additional rent control ordinance, it may or may not apply to you. So make sure you read the exemptions to find out if your property is part of that exemption or not. Now, the next section goes into administration. This is the governing body that is part of the city or the county that is going to be in charge of making sure that these rent control rules are followed. If you have any questions regarding rent control, these are also the correct people to contact. One thing that I really like that Nolo has done really well is that they have included all of the contact information for these administering bodies, which includes who they are, their phone number, their website, their email address, all of the ways that you can get in touch with them and ask any questions that you have. The next section for rent control deals with registration. So there's a lot of cities and towns that require registration for your rental units. This means letting the city know that this unit of your property is going to be rented, and also letting them know what the current rent is, if you're going to raise it. Sometimes there's paperwork involved that you need to file with the city in order to raise the rent for your tenant. This is very, very important, because if you run into a situation with your tenant where they are not paying rent, breaking the rules, basically you have just cause eviction on your side, but you failed to register with your city or with your county, your tenant can still win the eviction case just because you didn't follow all of the steps. So this is very, very important to know whether registration in your area is required or not, and it will say in the rent control ordinance, and it's also summarized pretty well on this NOLO site. The next section in the rent control ordinance deals with how much you can raise your rent. Now, this is usually based off of the CPI for your region, and we're gonna look at that in just a moment. So if you're wondering which region am I in, don't worry, we're gonna tell you. The rent control can be raised based off of, for example, at the state level, it's 5% plus the CPI for your region. The way that a lot of these rent control ordinances are written for different cities, sometimes it's just a percentage of the CPI itself. So for Los Gatos, you can raise the rent up to 70% of the CPI, and that's all written and spelled out here. But again, it's also really good to go and read the ordinance itself so that you really, really know and understand what it says. Finally, there's sections in the ordinance next about vacancy decontrol. What that means is that if a tenant has left your unit, it depends on the way that the tenant left the unit. Were they evicted? Was it a just cause eviction? Kind of what happened? What was the situation? Did they move out voluntarily? And that will tell you what you can re-rent that unit for. In most cases, when the tenant moves out voluntarily, you can re-rent your unit at market rent, but there are some cities and some counties that don't necessarily allow that. It still looks at what the previous tenant was paying, and you can only raise some amount beyond that. There is still a ceiling. So again, very important to know. And then typically the final section of the rent control ordinances deal with just cause evictions. So these are all of the reasons why you can potentially evict a tenant. Again, these things are very important to know, and it's very important that you follow all of the rules and regulations set out by the ordinance and your city. Now let's take a look at the CPIs for all of the different regions in California.
And what's CPI? CPI stands for Consumer Price Index. The way that the law was written is that a landlord could raise the rent during a 12-month period, 5% plus CPI. So we know that the minimum that a landlord could increase the rent would be 5%. Now there's the CPI component. CPI stands for the Consumer Price Index. That number is going to come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so the Labor Statistics Bureau keeps track of what the cost of milk goes up by, gas, cost of living, and there's a percentage. That is what they refer to as CPI. It's tracked on a monthly basis. And this law here in California decided, for whatever reason, to base it off the month of April. Now, in the month of April, it looks 1 month back. So how do you determine CPI?
There are 4 metro regions in California, as we mentioned. The first one is Los Angeles, and this includes all of LA County and all of Orange County. The second region is San Francisco. This includes San Francisco County, Marin County, San Mateo County, Contra Costa County, and Alameda County. So this is the largest region by far. The next one is the San Diego metro region, which includes all of San Diego County. And the final one is Riverside, which includes Riverside County and San Bernardino County. If you live in a county whose name I did not just mention, that means that you are part of the California CPI. So the CPI that will apply to you is going to be the state level California CPI. If I mentioned your county, you are using a regional CPI. These are the current CPIs for each of these regions. And I'm gonna say there's 5 regions because there's California plus the 4 metro regions. So for each of these 5 regions, the CPIs are listed here, and these are valid until July 31st of 2022. So for California, it's 4%. For LA, it was 3.6%. For San Francisco, 3.8%. San Diego 4.1%, and Riverside 3.6%. What we're seeing now is because we've had so much inflation over the last year, the CPIs have gotten pretty high. For Riverside, the Riverside region, the CPI is already 10%. For the San Diego area, it's already 7.9%. So for those areas, if you're in those regions and you're under the statewide rent control, which is CPI plus 5%, you're going to be at either 15% if you're in Riverside, or you're going to be at 12.9% if you are in San Diego. However, there is a provision in the statewide rent control, AB 1482, that says there is a cap at 10%. So that means that you are going to be hitting that rent cap. Now, if we look at the other regions, we've got LA County, which is already at 8.5%. And we have the San Francisco area, which is already at 5.2%. So following that same logic, those will also be beyond that 10% cap. So that's how we can really comfortably say that it's going to be 10% moving forward for the entire state. So for the entire state of California, if you are not one of the exempt units, which means rent control for the state does apply to you, the maximum allowable rent increase is going to be 10%. If you are in one of those other areas, make sure that you check your rent control for your area. It might be something that's tighter than 10%. For example, it might have an 8% cap. You might have a rent freeze. And so that's why it's really important to know and follow these steps to find out what rent control is going to be in your area. So now knowing this, continuing from now until July 31st of 2022, this year, we're still under all of the previous rent control that we've had for the last year. But starting August 1st, 2022, that's when this 10% rent cap will go into effect, and it will remain in effect until July 31st of next year, 2023. The final step in figuring out rent control for you, once you've done this research, is to actually call your city and your county and talk to somebody. Make sure that you've done your homework first so that you can bring all of your questions to them. And then once you've done the math to figure out what the increase should be, make sure you call your city and your county, talk to them, make sure there's not any steps that you've missed, make sure that there's no additional ordinances or legal things that might be coming down the pipeline that might affect the rent control for your area. I hope that helps, and I'll pass it back to Juan.
So thank you for tuning in. We spent hours researching this topic. Last year, it was our most popular video because it's impacting everyone's life. And so the information, you can't find it very easily. So we pulled in all the information to provide this video. So I ask you for your help. If you like what we've given you, please send us referrals. We have nationwide affiliates, statewide affiliates. If you like what we've given you, write me a Google review, Sage Real Estate. Subscribe, comment below, continue tuning in. Thank you so much.